about advances in research into genes today. And we have with us Paul Fayter, who is a historian of science, Dr. Gordon Murray, who researches genes, and Dr. Janet Warren, who is going to provide a theological perspective on the advances in scientific research into genes and their potential for creation and their potential for deep, profound moral quandaries for the Christian. Okay? Without further ado, let's have Reverend Fayter come up and he will introduce our topic and give some historical background. Thank you very much.
Paul. Here. Lots of great visual imagery to go with this talk, but I didn't get it together, so please use your imaginations. Two opening quotations. If scientists don't play God, who else is going to? That was a defiantly proud James Watson speaking in 2003, the year an essentially complete draft of the human genome was published. Second quotation. It's alive. It's alive! Now I know what it's like to be God. The titular scientist in James Whale's 1931 movie Frankenstein. Speaking of the reanimation of the dead, in the wake of recent theories, experiments, and public demonstrations by scientists including Erasmus Darwin, Luigi Galvani, Humphrey Davies, and Giovanni Aldini, Mary Shelley, in the introduction to the 1831 edition of her sensational 1818 novel Frankenstein, the book that gave birth to science fiction and popularized the idea of scientists playing God, wrote, quote, "Supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." In Shelley's novel, A Young Victor Frankenstein, not Dr. Frankenstein, but a 19-year-old undergraduate science student, says that after incredible labor, he succeeded in discovering the cause and generation of life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Was this astonishing intervention into the natural course of things, this playing God done, say, for the relief of human suffering? Not really. As Victor explains his motivation, a new species would bless me as its creator. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. The term playing God, rooted in a very long tradition of Greek tragedies about human hubris, myths of Pandora's box and Promethean overreaching, early modern legends of Faust, the Golem, and homunculi, the Gothic, romantic, science-fictional, Frankensteinian cautionary tales. Playing God is commonly used to express fears that we are going too fast and too far in our scientific and technological activities. Perhaps we have trespassed upon holy or unholy ground. We're now crossing old boundaries between life and death, creator and creature, the natural, the supernatural, the human and the non-human, or even the superhuman, the naturally evolved and the humanly or even divinely designed, the boundary between matter and information, the sacred and the secular. Previously, playing God has been invoked in debates over the atomic bomb, IVF, recombinant DNA, AI, robotics, and nanotechnology, for example. This analogy cum metaphor has often been used in recent debates about human, plant, and animal genetic engineering, and especially synthetic biology, embryonic stem cell research, human gene editing, cloning, and post-singularity/transhuman/cyborg/ digital transcendence and immortality speculations. I would like to ask today, does this religiously sounding term playing God even make sense? And is there a theologically less problematic description of the human scientific project? The philosopher Frederick Fayter tells the story of his father, who in 1922 as a boy in a rural Minnesotan community of Swedish immigrants, heard a Baptist preacher rail against his parishioners' use of newfangled lightning rods. He called them shiny spikes of faithlessness. Thunderbolts were God's to hurl, not man's to deflect. The fires of hell were even then being stoked for those who insisted on rising in rebellion against God's will by installing newfangled lightning rods. But, Foray reflects, could God's will truly be foiled by a steel rod and a grounding wire? Was it really wrong to protect family and livestock from the storms that swept in from the prairies with such seemingly undiscriminating force? Is it believable that the God we know in Jesus Christ would punish farmers for taking whatever meager technological precautions might be available against natural disasters? Popular memory recalls biblical stories of punishment meted out for human disobedience and pride, including the seeking of forbidden knowledge and godlike status. See Genesis 3 and 11, for example. But another careful reading of the Eden and Tower of Babel stories would show that they express ancient anxieties that human initiatives would be foiled by a deity who jealously guards divine prerogatives. My claim is that the idea of playing God is, from a Christian perspective at least, theologically dubious because it implies the creator of the universe is some insecure, lesser God that can be diminished by human achievement, a being that we are capable of imitating, but who is offended by scientific inquiry. The Lutheran theologian Ted Peters, in Playing God, Genetic Determinism and Human Freedom, unpacks three meanings of the term in the context of the revolutionary developments in genetics that allow us to probe and manipulate the molecular structure of our nature. The first sense, he says, has to do with learning God's awesome secrets and standing on the threshold of acquiring godlike powers. The second refers to, quote, the actual wielding of power over life and death. And the third sense, the focus in his book, involves the use of science to displace God's role in a project to alter life and influence human evolution. He says that playing God is actually a secular, not a theological term. And indeed, in my reading, it's most often used as a shorthand by journalists, popular science writers, ethicists, social critics, and even scientists, rather than theologians. Elsewhere, Peters has suggested that the deity referenced in Playing God is not the God of the Bible, but a deified nature. This rings true to me and reminds me of the gradual replacement of divine selection in Darwin's notebooks with natural selection. That is, with the new nature of Victorian science, assuming the powers of the abandoned God of orthodoxy. As a historian of science, theology, and science fiction, I see common invocations of Playing God, or Shelley's Frankenstein, or Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, or Huxley's Brave New World, by critics of genetic engineering and biotechnology. I see this as a rhetorical move that too often shuts off rather than advances critical examination of the issues. The idea behind the term is many centuries old and refers to trespassing into morally forbidden territory, exceeding our natural limitations, or presuming to have godlike power over life and death. The quest for knowledge that exceeds our wisdom, or for power without responsibility, is seen as sacrilegious, as if we finite beings could possibly usurp God's sovereignty, power, and glory. But we've always been able to procreate and kill, to heal and neglect. Whether we like it or not, as humans, we do have the power of life and death over others. We have, within the limits of our changing technical prowess, genetically manipulated other species and intervened in our own evolution for millennia. When we accept responsibility for moral decision-making and action in the world, we're not playing God. Rather, we're working at being our developing selves. We are learning to become human. We are working within nature, which monotheists understand as creation, the theater of God's glory and active presence. One could argue that we would be abdicating our creaturely responsibility as beings made in God's image. Beings made in God's image, as stewards of God's grace, as earth keepers, and as relatively free, moral, and intelligent agents. However marred we are by greed, selfishness, violence, and other powers of sin and death. It could be argued we're abdicating that responsibility were we passively to leave planetary care, protection, and direction of life and health to what we call nature, or acts of God. Now, warnings not to play God can have some very important social and ethical value if they lead to thoughtful caution and to sustained and disciplined consideration of the moral meanings and implications of our actions. It's sheer arrogance to imagine that we have the knowledge and wisdom to manipulate organisms and manage the whole earth, much less our own future evolution, without ill effects. Just because we can do something does not, of course, mean that we need to or ought to do it. Playing God signals, therefore, an appropriate anxiety about the consequences of unfettered research, of science without conscience, and autonomous, even out-of-control technology. But the playing God card can be little more than a lazy cliche signaling moral and intellectual cowardice, a reluctance to confront risk and accept responsibility. It can be a cheap, quick way to scold godless scientists for real and imagined transgressions. By definition, as finite creatures, we cannot compete or play at being the Holy One who can create ex nihilo, and who, as the very ground of being, sustains the very existence of all creatures in the cosmos. Our freedom and power to act at our creaturely level cannot threaten the sovereignty of God. Still, one can argue that we humans have not been only created, but commissioned to work faithfully and creatively in the world in light of the vision of a redeemed future. The biblical hope of a new creation we glimpse, for example, in Isaiah, in Romans, in Revelation. Fundamental to our efforts to discern how to act ethically and Christianly in the face of the new genetics is the question of theological anthropology. How do we understand our own humanity in light of our faith in God? This alone will not disclose how we should ethically conduct and apply genetic research. We also need robust theologies of creation, of covenant, of evil, and redemption. A fruitful theological concept of humanhood that's received a lot of attention in the science and religion dialogue over the last 25 years is that of created co-creator, as defined and developed especially by Philip Hefner. The book of Genesis declares that we are made in the image of a creator God. Thus, we blessed creatures are also made with the capacity to be creative. Our creativity has been expressed in many ways: music, art, literature, in medicine, engineering, physics, and genetics, to name a few. We can create new ideas, new materials, new microbial and transgenic organisms. As created, we are entirely dependent upon God for our existence, having emerged from a cosmos created by divine fiat. For Christians, as for Jews and Muslims, our proper stance is one of deep humility, gratitude, and reverent awe before the Creator. We can never equal or rival God. We are bearers of the Creator's image. But we do exist as such in deep relationship with God as co-creators, and the co does not imply equality with God. We have the image of God in us. By our choices and actions, we reflect that image. As part of an evolving universe, become aware of itself. We have, through technology and science, the power and the freedom to shape nature toward the divine telos, the ultimate purpose of all things, not simply shape nature toward our own ends. Ronald Cole Turner, in his book, The New Genesis, offers a critical revision of Hefner's concept of the created co-creator. He proposes that we humans have a vocation from God to participate in the creative and redemptive transformation of nature. The genetic engineering of organisms, including cloning, could then be seen not as a hubris-laden example of playing God, but as a natural extension via human activity of divine creativity. I am not as deferential towards science nor as sanguine about human goodness as Cole Turner seems to be. However, I do appreciate his desire to neither demonize nor deify technology, and his theology of God as more than a super being who can be threatened by our apparently Promethean intentions. Dare we dream of a redeemed science that's both godly and truly human? Can genetics serve the aims of the peaceable kingdom of God, aims such as justice, love, compassion, abundant life, and joy? I want to be open to that possibility while maintaining a degree of skepticism and suspicion. I think human reproductive cloning, for instance, is ethically unacceptable at present. I think designing enhanced humans is playing with fire and raises almost inevitably the demonic specters of eugenics. increased inequality and bodily weaponization. Work by Hefner and others on the idea of we humans as created co-creators, I think deserves to be critically examined, used, and tested and developed. In New Genesis, Cole Turner argues that Christianity must both absorb new scientific insights and remember its own core beliefs in creation and redemption, sin and grace, incarnation and transfiguration. According to Genesis, creation was made and blessed by God. It is both good, yet disordered somehow by sin. Quote, if such a moral disorder exists in nature, writes Cole Turner, and if God is understood to be at work creatively and redemptively resolving that disorder, and if we recognize ourselves as invited by God to participate in that creative and redemptive work, then we can see that our technology, including genetic engineering, as a partnership with God in the expanding and redeeming of nature. As Jewish writers since at least the time of Rabbi Hillel have expressed it in many different contexts, we have a God-given holy obligation of tikkun olam, the mending or healing, literally the perfecting of the world. Thank you and amen.
All right.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to give this presentation. I obtained my PhD from Trinity College Dublin many years ago, and my career has been in clinical research with the pharmaceutical industry in North America. I want to give recognition to the fact that the images in this presentation are courtesy of Wikipedia Commons. Firstly, I'm going to review developments in genetics with specific emphasis on the last 70 years, during which genetics merged first with molecular biology and more recently with molecular engineering. Now, I know there's some engineers here and I don't want you to feel left out. First of all, let's start 4,600 years ago. The practice of crossbreeding animals and plants to select for desirable traits has been going on for millennia, and we get a glimpse in Genesis chapter 30 of Jacob's attempts to breed sheep for his own wealth. This is the species of sheep which is still around. There have been flocks in North America, and the state of Israel is now collecting these sheep so they'll have an ongoing safe home. In the 1860s, Gregor Mendel laid the foundation for the rules of inheritance. Now, folklore and culture had shown people how they could produce desirable traits in plants and animals, but Gregor Mendel in the Western world was the first to lay down the foundation, and he called these concepts of inheritance genes, along with the concept of a dominant gene and recessive genes. Now, as an example, the gene for brown eyes is dominant. So it would be very unlikely for two blue-eyed parents to produce a brown-eyed child. However, it's not unusual for brown-eyed parents to produce blue-eyed children. Of course, it's not as clear-cut because you've got other genes involved. You've got hazel eyes and green eyes and grey eyes and all sorts of things. Now I assume 2 pages at once. In April 25th, 1953, Watson and Crick published their paper showing the structure of DNA and how it replicated and passed the information on down the generations. This was about 100 years after Mendel's work laying the foundation for inheritance. And I have a copy of Watson's paper here, if anyone would like to have a look at it sometime. April the 25th, 1953, by the way, was another significant date. It was my 9th birthday. But it was many years when I met Watson later and told him it was many years before I read his paper. For those of you who barely know what DNA is, and I assume there might be some, this is DNA The red and blue are the parent strands. It zips apart and new strands are put in place. These strands are mirror images of each other. So when DNA splits, the daughter strands contain the same information as the parental strand. And by the way, when we're talking about information, the amount of information in a single human cell is about 15 gigabytes. That's about 2 CDs worth. If you stretch the DNA end to end, it would be about 1 meter long. And the width of the DNA strand is just maybe 5 times smaller than the width of the narrowest connections in the current microprocessors. I think, Ian, they're probably about 15 nanometers now for processors. DNA is about three of those nanometers. And for historians, this is a sketch of that Crick did when he was deciding what the structure of DNA is. And for those who'd like to read, I'm skipping too many. Okay. In the 1990s, and notice how the timelines are getting shorter, the USA government decided to sequence the human genome. It cost $3 billion and took 15 years. It involved laboratories around the world. The project was headed up for the US government by Francis Collins, an evangelical Christian. He has written this book, The Language of God, which I really recommend to any of you who are interested in learning more about this and how he handles the issue of creationism, DNA analysis, etc. So it's a very good book. Have any of you read it? Right. What do you think of it?
Fantastic. It changed my whole view of comfortableness with science.
Yeah, sure. There was also an independent project by the Celera Corporation. They also sequenced DNA independently. Now let's go forward to 2013. This is a handheld DNA sequencer made by a UK company called Oxford Nanopore. During the Ebola outbreak in Africa a couple of years ago, a researcher flew to the affected area with 3 DNA sequencers in his carry-on bags. Using these, he was able to study the epidemiology of the Ebola outbreak by tracking the spread of virus clades, that is, tribes of the virus, almost in real time. This was extremely useful in helping to understand how the disease was being spread and to intervene at key points to try and stop it spreading. The clinical potential for these is remarkable. The sequencer, however, capable of sequencing a human genome is still the size of your desktop laser printer. A new model coming out is interestingly called the Prometheon. Now, I'm not quite sure. I need a classics input as to what the impact of that name is. Can you give me some idea who Prometheus was?
In both Greek and Roman mythology, Prometheus was a person who tried to steal fire from the gods to help humans. The gods really didn't care much about humankind.
Okay.
And was punished for his overreaching, his sin of daring to do such a thing.
Thank you. In development is a DNA sequencer for your smartphone. It just plugs into your smartphone. The smartphone sends a sequence to the internet and comes back with the identification of the organism whose DNA you fed into this. Now, while all these technological advances are tremendous, and one of these in the pocket of every physician could be really useful in diagnosing say, bacterial infections, and like when I had to grow the little buggers on agar plates when I was doing my PhD, all you need is minutes to get the identification here. But there is a dark side. The flip side of the internet is the potential for monitoring private communications. We all love the internet, the amount of information we can get, but we all know, of course, that who might be listening. And it's not necessarily God, it could be our government. What might happen is that you go to your family physician, he takes a pinprick of blood for DNA sequencing on his desktop sequencer. I expect this will be as routine as giving blood when you go to a clinic. The DNA sequence is read by a website where a huge database is assessed to provide very useful diagnostic information to help your doctor determine a course of treatment. Now, who would be likely to fund such a website, and how might they make a profit from it? I'll leave that to your imagination. But as you know, from the light of illegal communications surveilled by security authorities around the world, including, I believe, in our country, can we trust that Bill S-201 to protect Canadians against genetic discrimination, can we trust that that will actually work? It's a question for discussion. In 2015, there was a game changer. The American Society for the Advancement of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, identified CRISPR as a breakthrough. I'm not going to go into the technical details of CRISPR. It's not my area of research, and it's very complicated, although the concept is not too difficult. But this gives you the potential to edit a genome. Remember 3 billion base pairs, 15 gigabytes. It gives you the potential to edit a genome analogous to a word processor editing a document, for example, with search and replace. So for the first time in the 3.7 billion years of life on Earth, the germline can now be deliberately changed. Genetic function can now be transferred across the tree of life, and such transfer is no longer limited to crossbreeding between related species. Some people will say, there's nothing new in all this, we've always been doing crossbreeding, but yes, it's between related species. There are ethical problems here. You can take a gene from a fish and put it into a tomato plant, and you increase the shelf life of the tomatoes. But should someone allergic to fish eat that tomato? That's a fairly simple example. And we're not finished yet. In 2016, in May, a project has been started called HGB Write, Human Genome Project Write. It's a project to synthesize de novo an entire human genome. I'm not sure what they're going to do with the genome once they get it. The genie, pun intended, is out of the bottle. And genies, as you know, give you a wish, or wishes when they come out. So what are our wishes for these tremendous advances in genetic engineering? Do you wish to eliminate diseases which have a genetic origin? Do you want to design our children to be disease resistant? Do you want to design our children to be more intelligent? Think, how many creative people throughout the world have been schizophrenic, depressive, or just plain nuts? If you remove these from the human genome, are we in danger of becoming a more bland race? Now, whether you believe in evolution as the result of random mutations which are selected by the environment, or with the finger of God poking into your DNA, with the power of God now at our fingertips, how do we address the ethical challenges? And what are the rules of the game when playing God? Finally, are we ready to boldly go where only God has gone before? Thank you very much.
the disadvantage of going last is that some of the stuff I was planning to mention has been mentioned already. Not a lot, though. So my first sort of thoughts into the idea of playing God came in medical school when I encountered a few physicians, mostly surgeons, who acted like they were God and could do everything and intimidated us poor medical students. The idea, as Paul already mentioned, is common in popular culture. There's at least there's a movie out called with that name. There's at least 2 books out with that name. Cartoons, even. Everybody read that? So aside from my medical school and family practice experience, it's come more recently with the recent legislation about physician-assisted suicide. However, as Paul mentioned, the concept is not particularly biblical, and in fact, most people use it and they don't really define what they're referring to. According to the very credible Wikipedia, that's the definition. It can also be referred to, called apotheosis, or theosis, the Greek term for gods, playing God, or deciding who is to live or died. And it's usually an expression that's used to invoke a precautionary principle, so advise caution. And also, as Paul mentioned, theologians think that the idea of playing God is foreign to theologians and probably originated with Frankenstein. So Christians look to the Bible, but as we know, the idea of genetics and genetic engineering simply wasn't conceived of, so we really cannot find our answers in there. So it doesn't give specific advice on complex topics, so we have to look and infer, get guidance from general principles. So the Bible is primarily a story of divine redemption. And the story continues today. So the Bible doesn't coerce or constrain people to act in a particular way. Genuine decisions must be freely made, but hopefully with wisdom and with consultation with biblical principles. When we look to principles for ethical behavior, it's more than just picking a few verses at random from the Bible that tell us to do good and tell us what not to do and not murder, etc. I think we need to look at the bigger picture and look at the biblical worldview. So I'm going to look at 3 principles. So first of all, we're created to be in relationship with God, to worship and obey and trust God alone, as Exodus 20 talks about in the 10 Commandments. Isaiah also talks about not trusting in humans, trusting in God alone. In fact, life is dependent on God, as Job talks about. If God withdraws his spirit, death results. God keeps us alive moment by moment. Along with worshiping God, we're to avoid pride, which is self-worship in a way. And many of the Proverbs talk about the dangers of pride. In Ezekiel's prophecy against the king of Tyre, he talks about the dangers of pride. Paul's teaching also talks about the dangers of pride. Another form of pride can be found in what a lot of people call scientism, or worshiping science as opposed to worshiping God. And again, science isn't really in the Bible, but you can infer it from Isaiah's prophecy of the divine judgment. And note that he's saying that the work of the hands or technology itself is not necessarily wrong, but worship of the technology is. And C.S. Lewis also has a similar caution, which you can read. The second principle is that humans are created in the image of God, as we know from Genesis 1. Now, this idea of the image of God is multifaceted. It includes relational aspects, functional aspects, structural aspects. But in general, the idea is that humans are sacred. Humans are considered sacred from conception to death. We're all children of God, and as such, we have dignity. Ethical life includes valuing, respecting, and protecting. And note in the biblical view, they're moral absolutes versus the ethical ideas of utilitarianism or consequentialism, which state that what we ought to do is simply determined by what will produce the best overall results. It's just a very practical one. The Bible has a different view on that. The idea of being made in God's image includes our bodies. We're told to honor our bodies. The body is a place where we can learn our attitudes and skills. Therefore, we should sustain our bodies. We should restore our bodies when they're damaged and improve them in order to best serve God and others. We should be stewards of our bodies. Hopefully, we all brushed our teeth this morning, for instance. And I never miss the opportunity to give a plug for the importance of exercise. The idea of being made in God's image includes modeling God, modeling his character, his priorities, his creativity. By showing God's grace in caring for ourselves, we show what God is like. Paul also teaches about having Christ-like character and behavior. Then this image is not just on an individual level, it's also a communal level. And a third principle is that we're commanded to care for creation, the famous creation mandate. And Paul already talked about this in terms of us being stewards of creation. Now remember, the original garden, it was complex. It needed tending. It involved some exploration. It was developed for the benefits of humans and for to the glory of God. Humans were considered priests of creation in tending the garden. And note that in tending this garden, it's not just talking about pride, but the opposite of the dangers of sloth or inaction and not doing anything. So not letting the weeds just grow in the garden running wild. And this is particularly important when we're talking about caring for ourselves and caring for other humans. Jesus, of course, was the epitome of modeling caring for others, especially in his healing. He also commanded his followers to do the same, and he gave us authority to heal every disease and sickness. In the idea of anointing with oil can be seen as a technology in a sense, of a device for healing. In Matthew's parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus taught us to feed the hungry and the thirsty, clothe the stranger, visit the sick. The book of Acts contains many stories of healing and caring for others. Jesus also promised us divine guidance in leading the humble and teaching the humble his way. Note that there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Science can increase our knowledge, but it's not necessarily accompanied by wisdom regarding the use of the knowledge. The idea of caring for creation also involves the use of developing tools. The story of Isaiah is an example of the technology that he used, his shields and spears he developed, but in a way of scientism, again, he worshipped the technology instead of worshipping God, and his pride was his downfall. Now, our creation, our world is constantly changing, whether we like it or not. Sometimes it moves slowly, and sometimes it moves very fast, as Gord mentioned, with some scary new advances in genetics. And a lot of people historically have been resistant to change, as Paul mentioned with this fear about lightning rods. So a lot of the following I got from James Peterson's excellent book, Changing Human Nature. And some of you may know James is the past president of the CSCA. So he says, we do need to shape creation. It's going to change, but the important thing is that we do it with wisdom. The problem is, when we look to these biblical principles to guide our behavior, there's a lot of ambiguities. And I'll focus on medical, ethical ones in particular. So it's difficult to know what God's ideal creation is because we only have access to seeing the corrupted one that we live in. So we're created in God's image, but we have been corrupted. There's also a lot of ambiguities even in definitions. It used to be easy to distinguish between life and death, for instance. But how do we define life? As technology increases, the definitions can get more ambiguous. So does life begin at conception, or does life begin at transition from the womb into the outside world? Furthermore, we often view life as a gift from God. But sometimes when you look at some devastating genetic diseases that babies are born with, it can be difficult to view that as a gift from God. And babies that in the past would not have survived, but now can survive. Similarly with death, technology can now sustain cardiopulmonary function, so it becomes more difficult to define what death is. It's also difficult to define disease. So disease it's not just physical, but includes psychological, spiritual, social, etc. There's a judgment factor. For instance, some people would see deafness as a disease. Other people don't necessarily see it as a disease. If I described a condition of intermittent paralysis with intermittent hallucinations, you might be all very worried until you remember that we all do it about 8 hours a day. If you describe a condition that has congenital onset characterized by dwarfism and legume phobia, you might also be concerned until you realize that children run around all the time. So some diseases can be seen as good in that they can produce immunity to future diseases. People with ADD, for instance, can be very creative. And Gord alluded to some of this in terms of if we get rid of all disease with genetic intervention, are we just going to have a very bland, boring creation? But the idea is too that we turn against the disease, but we don't turn against those who are diseased. The idea of medical assistance can also be ambiguous. So we could talk about the dangers or concerns with tube feeding, but remember that we feed babies with a bottle all the time, and that's not considered a problem. Problems with intervention. People say, okay, well, genetics are fine as long as you don't intervene. But we frequently intervene already. We practice surgery, we give antibiotics. So is it just different degrees? Enhancement. All of us, most of us, have availed of some enhancement. Many of us are wearing glasses. That's a form of enhancement. Running shoes can be seen as a form of enhancement because they help you run better. So the whole definition of, should we use genetic interventions just to improve health or just to cure disease, it can become ambiguous. And it is value-laden, and we need to recognize that. So unfortunately, ethics and philosophy usually raises more questions than it gives answers. So we have to think, are we trying to play God, which is considered a bad thing, being proudful, or are we being responsible in caring for creation and imaging God and being Christ-like in our care for others? Jim Peterson concludes that genetics does not make us better, but it may make us more capable. It may free us from constraints, and it may increase our abilities and choices so that then we can be freer to serve God in other ways. And he talks about some standards, so being safe, being a genuine improvement, increasing choice for those who are receiving it, using resources wisely. So in sum, thinking about whether it's a way that we love God, love one another, and love creation. Thanks.
Thank you, Janet. Let's just give her a nice hand for all of our panelists today. Thank you all.
Ian Rowe. The theologians very interestingly use the word "we" relative to the ethics decisions and so on. And the playing God, in my view, is really a metaphor for the decision process of we, humankind, who possesses consciousness and hopefully compassion. I'd like to suggest to you that there's another playing God issue that we have to soon address, and that's the role of big data. Right now, we have a situation, Gordon can expand on that, where Watson can make better medical decisions than a cadre of physicians. And the big data does not have compassion, does not have consciousness, and I suggest the domain of playing God is soon going to be passing into the hands of big data, how it is managed, and how it would possibly mismanaged. I'm concerned about the we. Have we lost the capacity to make decisions?
I think we may be in danger of losing that capacity. Watson, by the way, you may have seen it on The Price is Right. It was a computer which would beat humans. The days of computers beating chess players that's passé now. But Watson is this gigantic computer complex, and as Ian has pointed out, it will very soon have the capability of making clinical decisions, but without the compassion and without the compassion and love, which we would expect at least some of our physicians to possess. Paul?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
So Jim Peterson addresses the issue of who should make the decision. So if you're talking about a decision for a child, should it be the parents making the decision? Should it be the doctors? Should it be the government? Should it be, a team of experts? And the advantage for the team of experts would be maybe a little bit like the computer and having the facts, but they wouldn't have the personal connection, whereas the parents would have the love for the child and the personal connection, but then they wouldn't necessarily have the knowledge. So he, somewhat idealistically, I think, suggests that it should be all of those involved. So in fact, increasingly in medicine, it is being discovered that machines do beat humans, and but nobody yet wants to do away with the humans, fortunately. But blood pressure machines are a lot more accurate in taking blood pressures than humans are, and that's been a change just in the last 20 years. So I don't think we want to do away with the algorithms, etc. entirely, but I don't think we could ever want to depend on them alone.
Janet used the word pride. I'm an organic chemist, synthetic organic chemist, like Louis Pasteur. So I deal with messy stuff and I transform it to better stuff. And I know there's always side reactions. And in chemical reactions, it's not just one arrow this way. There's a little arrow going the other way. And then there are side reactions. And this is pride, thinking that our ability to avoid these unwanted things are not there, but they are always there. So our pride takes us assuming that somebody else is going to do the corrections like 20 years later. We do a genetic thing, and then 20 years later, the genetic change that was made appears. Not at the beginning, but 20 years later.
Yeah.
Somebody else has to deal with it.
Yeah, and it's not just a question of pride. It can also be due to ignorance or lack of knowledge.
Yes. Or trust. Who do you trust?
I think we have to tread very, very carefully. I alluded to you want to think very carefully before you try to eliminate some mental diseases from the genome, because the results could be very counterproductive.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And I guess I've been away from you too long, but the genome itself, how does that get manifested into life? I mean, I'm assuming the genome is in every cell, yet not every cell which is differentiated is performing at the same capacity, the same role. There's a gap in there for me.
Yeah, well, each cell in the body which has a nucleus, which is where the genome lives, and by the way, red blood cells do not have any DNA, but each cell has a copy of all the DNA, about 15 gigabytes, but only about 5% of the DNA is translated into proteins which make up the majority of our body structure. The remaining 90%, which is just beginning to be understood, is involved with controlling which proteins are made in which cell, and that's the process going on which determines eventually when a cell becomes a neuron or a muscle cell. All of the DNA, but not all of it, is expressed everywhere.
Is there any hint at what may trigger in the differentiation process? What triggers?
There are some hints. It appears that some of the DNA is copied into little segments of DNA which attach on and stop certain genes from working. And if there are any biologists here who are in this field, maybe they could comment on this. Any of the students, biology? No? But
I think you're just talking about the whole process of development. The beginning of fertilization to the end and death. To say we understand any part of it is an exaggeration.
Do we understand
That's-
anything?
Well,
That's one
parts that
question.
show some parts that you talk
unfortunately,
about.
the experiences
Discussion. But take the DNA from the very beginning as the genome of a fertilized egg and say what it would become, I think is beyond anyone.
At this time?
Pardon?
At this time?
I think at any time, but that's just my opinion.
I think there's a question down here, or a comment.
Yeah, just a real quick question. So, one of the definitions on one of the final slides was that, what should be considered good is something that enhances choice and forget the exact wording, helps an individual to flourish, let's say. So I'm wondering, what if we found a genetic sequence that allowed humans to grow wings? I mean, that increases choice and opportunity and so on. Is that an ethical thing for us to be pursuing, turning ourselves into something perhaps we're not intended to be? But it gets to enhancement. I mean, I appreciate my glasses, but there are other kinds of enhancements that perhaps step on ethical grounds that we ought to be careful.
Yes, I think it's probably more likely, just a sec, probably more likely we could grow gills and live underwater than grow wings. But
wouldn't this mean keep it because we might need it? In other words, the biodiversity that we have within our genomes has allowed us to live up till now on this planet.
Yeah.
And if we start limiting that by saying, and I think you mentioned this earlier, we limit that by saying, okay, well, this is a bad gene. Let's change it in everyone. Maybe we're limiting our ability to fly if we need to, because who knows? We may need to fly on this planet to survive. I mean,
Or
we
other
just don't know
planets.
what's going to happen in the future.
yeah, and maybe there's a point to be made for what happens if we increase the diversity of the human genome. People haven't talked about that. And by the way, there's an awful lot of talk about so-called junk DNA. Don't believe any of it. It's not junk. We don't know what it does.
Yeah.
But those sequences of DNA in the junk part have maintained fairly constant over broad stretches of the tree of life. So they're obviously doing something very important. But it would be interesting to increase diversity if we could.
Well, again, I would have to be careful with that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what we have. It's done us pretty good up till now. If we start altering it, maybe we will lose the ability to fly when we need it.
Well, I guess I was getting at the point too that perhaps just increasing options and flourishing is not sufficient. I mean, maybe there's some other boundaries that we need to respect too when it comes to being what we were created to be, and how you could tighten that conversation so that you would be able to approach situations like that with a little bit more nuance and thought.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other thing is stories of non-genetic enhancements, like the athletes taking steroids and, doing really well, but then suffering later in
Sure.
life with major consequences.
Yeah.
So that they didn't know about at the time. So that the same could be with genetic enhancements. Sure, there's some good, but there could also be a downside to it that we don't know about. And a comment about the diversity thing. We're born with almost infinite potential, and from the moment of we're born, it's always being narrowed down and genes. If you look at babies, certain language abilities, they have it all, and then by the time of 2, half of them have been shut down, depending on what culture they live in, what language they're hearing. So that's just one example. But our environment, our culture, our social life has a huge effect on the expression of genes even. So must never discount. I think somebody mentioned that already. Just the value of humans is we're a lot more than our genes, basically, and the value of human society, but the influence it has. So, maybe somewhere we do have some other potentials that have been sort of socialized out of us, and that we do need to be more open to.
For me, there's ethical questions concerning genetic and technological enhancements of the human body that go beyond unforeseen or unintended consequences and things going sideways and things showing up decades later and all that kind of stuff. But at the level of social justice, for instance, enhancements are expensive, and certainly not everyone in the world who needs enhancements not to become superhuman, but simply to be brought up to a normal level of ability. That's expensive, and I don't see anybody going to pay for that for all sorts of poor people in the developing world and elsewhere who need those kinds of resources. So there's a question of inequality built into this. I also think there's, for various very good historical reasons, there's always the danger of eugenics lurking over this kind of question. When I was first taught history of science and genetics and so on, I was taught things like, those Nazi scientists, they were just on the fringe. They were kooks. They were crazy. They were idiots. Well, no, they weren't. They were mainstream scientists with chairs at major universities. Same thing with eugenics and various kind of racial purities and impurities you're trying to eliminate or acquire. That was mainstream thinking. You can find it in all the major biologists in the 19th and 20th century. And that's extremely dangerous because we know it has actually been enacted into law and millions of people have lost their lives over this ideology of racism that was not on the fringe of science, but was embedded in science and technology.
There's an example of an American preacher who gave a famous sermon. I forget his name, sorry, but he was a member of the American Eugenics Society. So, it's easy to say it was just those, evil Nazis over there, but
it was everybody
it was
across the spectrum.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so many people we talk to in our society are so disappointed that the billions and billions of dollars spent on cancer research has very little results. We still have so many cancers in our society. So my question is, the role of the discovery and the development of the genome, human genome, has that greatly accelerated the fight against cancer, and where are we going with that in the molecular structure?
Well, the advances in genetic engineering and technology is certainly increasing our knowledge of how cancer operates. And I would just take a little issue with your statement that little or no progress has been made.
A very quick comment about this cancer, and then a different question. I mean, the whole cancer field and the whole medicine field is suffering from over-promise. We seem to be kind of a mad rush. There's too much promise, and given the large amount of promise,
an expectation of funds, I mean, public is right to ask the question that where is the progress? So absolutely, a lot of things have changed. People are living longer. More pain and suffering has been removed. But I think it's a part of culture. We are over-promising. Not only over-promising, we want to do promising that we will do it sooner than we know. So that's another problem how science is done. But I have a different question. One is that on any new technology, the CRISPR, manipulating genes and doing this, this kind of discussion have gone on before about other technology, and whenever something new comes and there is the danger of misusing it. So the whole use of word ethics and morality applies to individuals. But I maintain that a group of people that together can do something wrong which individually they would not do.
How many of you have watched Orphan Black?
No.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's it's a sci-fi movie. I think it originates in Canada. But the last season it was dealing with an organization which promised you more intelligent children, and tried to deal with some of the ramifications of that. But what you say is very true. The problem is if someone can make money out of it, they're going to.
If we look at the food industry, organic chemistry.
Speak louder, please.
Yeah.
If you look at the food industry, and I'm an organic chemist, a carbohydrate chemist, that's sugars. The sugar industry has been pushing sugar into every food possible. It causes obesity. It causes all kinds of diseases. But if you watched Marketplace just a few days ago, repeated, the sugar industry says we give choice to people. It's their fault if they don't choose the low sugar. And this is a scientist actually saying this into the camera. We give choice, and this is a country where choice is number one. But I can tell you, it's a very easy way to make tons of money with sugar and fructose. So I am not hopeful about the commercialization of the technology for the benefit of the masses. So that's where really the system has to change so that the power of half-truths is limited by the very powerful psychological messages that actually then makes the participant the guilty one because they chose the wrong one. It really makes me boil.
There's a question there.
Yeah, I have a question, and I also just wanted to comment on the cancer research statement that you made. My understanding, I don't know, I was in an immunology course today, and they were talking about some of the advances that have been made, for example, with leukemia treatment and that kind of thing, really incredible advances. But my perception of it was less that we're not making advances and more so that it's incredibly expensive. So they have these treatments that have come out from all the money that's gone into the research, but then, like you were saying, with the discrepancy between rich and poor, to actually, even someone who's wealthy would probably not be able to receive some of the treatments that have come out just because of the expense behind them. So maybe that's kind of the bigger issue. But my question was more, because I don't know much about genetic manipulation, and what is it exactly, at least at this point in time, that people are thinking of manipulating? Because you said, for example, so increasing intelligence. Well, what is intelligence? How do you define intelligence? Because there are people who would fall somewhere on the autism spectrum, and they might not have social intelligence, but they have incredible intelligence in terms of, dealing with numbers or facts. And so I agree with your statement. There's this very real chance of a slippery slope where it's totally culturally determined how you decide what is valuable within these categories. But in terms of right now, where does it stand?
But I don't think the science or the technology is anywhere at the point where we could change the intelligence by interfering with the germline. I mean, that may happen in the future, but we're not there yet. What's more likely to happen is if you can eliminate the GC repeats which cause Huntington's disease from a germline, maybe that would be a good idea. Because as far as we know, those GC repeats don't do anything. Sorry, if there are too many. The more GC repeats you have in that part of your genome, the earlier you develop the disease. But it might be a good idea to start with something simple, without too many side effects. Yes?
I'm sorry, why would we want to increase intelligence? I'm sorry.
Oh, I said I don't think we're at the point where we could do that.
Why would we want to anyway?
I wasn't advocating that we do it. It might be a potential in some years' time.
No, but even if it were a potential, why as human beings
Okay, let me put it this way.
increase our intelligence?
If I can be very personal here, are you proud of your children?
Of course.
Are you proud of their achievements?
Of course.
Wouldn't you like maybe subtly to wish they could achieve more if they had more brain power?
No, I don't think it would necessarily make them any happier or me any happier.
Okay, that's you, but there are other people who would see it differently.
No, I hear what you're saying.
That's a whole.
Yeah.
As human beings on this planet, what would we gain by having more intelligence?
Well, I agree, because then you're just really resetting the standard, right? Like, so then if we can all increase our intelligence, we're no longer intelligent. More intelligent, because we're all at the same time. I totally agree with what you're saying. But I feel like from a personal perspective, people think, oh, I could make my child smarter, great, you know? Like, I get what you're saying.
But why don't you talk about a more immediate objective of gene editing? Let's say you could edit the gene of an embryo that had cystic fibrosis. What would be the ethical problem there?
I think the ethical problem would be, would the people doing that know how to do it properly?
Well, I think they would.
Hopefully they would.
This is something that is pretty well been identified as a single gene, a single mutation.
Chloride
a single
transport.
correctable mutation. And presumably, the first experiment, which you may say would be unethical, would demonstrate that correcting that mutation would correct the disease. So what would be the ethical problems? I mean, I'm not saying I would recommend doing it, I'm just asking you what the ethical problems in such a procedure would be.
There may well be other options, genetic manipulation of somatic cells in a developing individual to handle that issue and essentially get rid of
the fetus to develop cystic fibrosis and then correct that into somatic cells?
Well, we're not at that point yet, but there is some progress in correcting the somatic cells in a patient with cystic fibrosis.
There's a lot of progress in treating cystic fibrosis, but as an alternative, correcting it in the embryo, let's say.
I don't see an ethical problem with that.
Okay.
So I think where the ethical slippery slope comes is which disease do you target? Which do you define as a disease? Amos Young, another well-known theologian, has a brother with Down syndrome, and he's written a book about Down syndrome. He says the world would be an impoverished place if we didn't have the number of Down syndrome people in the world
that
we
would
do.
be a discussion in society that would be easily tackled.
Not,
But
I don't think
anyone
it would
would
be
defend
easily.
allowing cystic fibrosis children to be born.
Yeah, okay, but there's just, there's a zillion other diseases. So what do? You have your list, and then
I
you're
don't see
playing
that
God.
as
This
really
one
very
gets
compelling, though,
this
because
one is a disease.
There's
This
a
one
zillion
is
diseases. Why not start somewhere?
But where's the funding coming from?
Well, that's the problem.
That's
isn't
another
it?
issue.
How do you spend the money? Do you spend it on building accelerators or fighter jets or missiles?
Yes, sir.
Just backing up a little bit. I think the problem is not with science.
Per se.
And the problem is not with computers and machines. Computers don't tell us what to do. And if computers were able to diagnose illnesses and so on, that would be advice for my physician or my team of healthcare providers. The problem, I think, has always been and will always continue to be, what do we as humans consider it right to do? How will we act? And I think we as Christians and as Christian scientists, I think we can give leadership in that. And the problem is not what can science do, but the question is, how are all of us supposed to act? How should we act in being responsible? The comment was made, what we're intended to be. How do we know what we are intended to be? It's not what we were before. God has called us to take care of and develop this creation. It began with a garden, it will end in a city with all the human productivity. But what's the responsible thing for us to do? What are responsible decisions to make, developments to make? And that will always be the question that we need to face.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that's about all we have time for. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the excellent questions.